This is Market Pathways, your premium guide to global medical device regulation, reimbursement, and policy. Become a part of the global medtech community at mystrategist.com. On this episode of Market Pathways, Stephen Levin, Editor-in-Chief, sits down with Mark Leahey of the Medical Device Manufacturers Association. Listen in as they discuss legislative, regulatory, and policy changes device manufacturers should anticipate in the coming year. This interview was recorded at the end of August 2021. To read up on any developments since then, visit mystrategist.com.
We're very pleased today to have Mark Leahey, CEO of MDMA Trade Association, on hand for our podcast. That is really, we're calling the start of the new school year. What can we look forward to in medtech? And Mark, it's always a pleasure to have you. I can't think of a better person to discuss with us the upcoming year in terms of legislative, regulatory, and policy developments in medtech than you and the great work that you do with MDMA on behalf of the industry. Let's start out with let's kind of talk about the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is the pandemic, and talk a little bit about the impact that COVID has had on the industry, the response of the industry, and specifically, let me ask you to address what temporary changes you think could become permanent in terms of things like telehealth or remote patient monitoring that we've seen grow, and that transition process from, let's say, an EUA to permanent approval. I know there's a lot there, but take that in whatever order you feel most comfortable.
No, thanks, Stephen. Again, appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Always enjoy the great work that you and the team do to highlight the innovation that our industry is bringing to bear and improving patient care and driving the economy forward. Obviously, COVID has presented a number of challenges and opportunities for our industry. I think on the positive side, I think the value of medtech, the impact that it has probably never been more visible, from both the diagnostic and the monitoring and other technologies out there to on the front lines to improve patient care. And a lot of this was driven by close collaboration with innovators, with the healthcare delivery system, with federal government, with local governments to move quickly to try to cut red tape while now not cutting corners, but just moving efficiently, effectively to meet the needs of the moment. And as you noted, I think there were a number of both regulatory and reimbursement changes that were made on a temporary basis that CMS and a number of the proposed rules have proposed extending those. And so I think you'll have what's telehealth. Some of the enhanced guidance is coming out of FDA, providing clarity as to what types of changes or products you can bring to the market without maybe a specific authorization. You also noted, obviously a significant increase in the EUAs, and based upon comments that Dr. Shuren and others have stated, we expect an orderly transition from those products that have an EUA now. It's not going to be a light switch that's on and then it'll flip off once the public health emergency is over. I think FDA has indicated anywhere from a 12 to 18 month ramp once the public health emergency is over for companies to file their submission if they want to continue to keep those products on the market after the public health emergency is over. I think it's a great opportunity too. Many have been talking about real world evidence. There's a lot of real world evidence being generated. We've seen this on the vaccine side. We've seen it on the device and diagnostic side. And so it's a real opportunity, I think, to pressure test some of these concepts, whether it's, again, real world evidence, the remote monitoring, telehealth. These are all, I think, areas of interest for many for many years. And as folks have said, basically through the pandemic, you probably, compressed and advanced forward, 5 to 10 years in a matter of 6 to 18 months because of the needs of the moment. So again, we're not out of the woods yet, obviously, but we are cautiously optimistic that vaccines will increase, variants will fade out, and the country will get back on strong health and financial footing, and there'll be a number of lessons learned and enhancements to the way we bring products to the market, the way we regulate and reimburse, and hopefully those will stay with us well beyond.
One other area that has been affected by the pandemic is clinical trials, and obviously a key area for our constituencies. What changes do you see that also might become permanent in the clinical trial process, or do you see things returning back to some degree of normalcy again post-pandemic?
I think one of the big challenges that we had with our members early on, particularly when elective procedures stopped, hospitals kind of closed their doors, the medical personnel who were involved in the clinical trials didn't have access. And so I think a couple of things have happened, and I think they will likely to remain beyond. One was the ability for, to monitor trials remotely. Maybe you don't have to physically be in the facility, or there are other ways in which you can collect this data in a more user-friendly way. And then also, I think we saw great flexibility with FDA, again, not lowering the bar by any stretch, but finding creative ways to generate meaningful data when there are some of these uncertainties that pop up. And so I think these are areas where, and again, just the broader networks, the remote monitoring, the acceleration of real world evidence. I think all of these point to a place where high quality evidence can be generated in a more effective and efficient manner that will hopefully accelerate patient access to safe and effective products.
That's a great overview of the pandemic and the impact that we're likely to see going forward, Mark. Let's move to the legislative side of things. And we're recording this before Labor Day in late August. And obviously things are very much in flux and could change prior to this podcast actually being published. But why don't we start on an optimistic note and talk about the Cures 2.0 legislation and the potential. And the reason I say optimistic is because in the current political environment, there are so few true bipartisan efforts. And in this case, you've got Representatives DeJette and Upton coming together again. They have a track record of doing this, done this before, to introduce this legislation. And I think this is something that, again, the medtech industry should be proud of, in the sense that you have a bipartisan group of representatives who believe strongly enough in the issues facing medtech to sponsor this legislation. So why don't you give us some background? Again, this is a follow-up on the 2016 Cures Act, and talk about where Cures 2.0 stands and what the potential is for this legislation.
Great. Well, as you noted, we do as an industry, I think, have a great track record of strong bipartisan support on a number of issues, whether that's the MDUFA reauthorizations each year, the repeal of the medical device tax. We really are able to bring Democrats, Republicans together because, we are an industry that improves patient care, drives innovation, and, is really the world leader when it comes to our industry. And obviously the leadership of Congresswoman DeJette and Congressman Upton, and again, working in, as you noted, in a bipartisan way to produce the Cures 2.0 draft, we just couldn't be more appreciative of their efforts. And again, as you noted, this is a framework to start the process to build on the 21st Century Cures Act, which helps spur patient access to the cures and therapies of tomorrow. And I think importantly to note, Vice President Biden at the time, now President Biden, was instrumental in driving forward on ways to accelerate patient access to innovative medical technologies and therapies. And so not only does it have bipartisan support on Capitol Hill, but I think the president has demonstrated a strong interest in building, whether it's Cancer Moonshot or building our capabilities in research development and bringing cures to the market more quickly. Interestingly, the original, I'll call it Cures 1.0, focused a lot on some of the regulatory enhancements, codified the breakthrough process that was in place administratively with FDA, but codified that. But maybe it was a little less focused. And again, they had some great provisions on local Medicare coverage and the max not allowing kind of just blanket non-coverage investigational policies without looking at the data. And that ultimately, those provisions led to the local max a few years ago retiring all their omnibus non-coverage policies, which I think has really helped patient access in a number of areas. But as we look to this 2.0 version, there are many substantive recommendations to improve how Medicare covers new innovative healthcare technologies while making them more accessible to the patients who need them. And again, I think as we just discussed, unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed ongoing challenges to the elective goal of delivering treatments to patients. And so I would argue that, again, the needs here to make sure that we have a strong regulatory and reimbursement system in place to drive patient access is critical. And again, as far as the future here, there are some broader political dynamics in place right now, as we may discuss relative to the infrastructure bill and the social infrastructure package that Democrats are pushing, what's going on in Afghanistan right now. So, there's strong interest here, but part of the reality in Washington is also looking at the calendar and whether we're certainly continued to work with our friends on both sides of the aisle to push this forward, whether it's able to move forward this year or next, or it will be taken piecemeal. I think those are all options that we will be exploring with policymakers.
I take your point, which is very well taken, about the unknown factor as to both in terms of the calendar and both whether this legislation continues, as it currently is constituted, or whether it gets broken up. But I would like to kind of give people a little bit of a taste of what they might expect in whatever format this eventually passes, if it obviously eventually passes. And a couple things that have been intriguing to me. One is kind of the reimbursement the provisions which you touched on. The other is this creation of what they're calling, I guess, ARPA-Health, ARPA-H.
ARPA-H, yep.
For people who are familiar with the DARPA in the Defense Department. I'll let you talk a little bit about that. And the other was the VALID legislation and how that impacts in vitro diagnostics. And I know that's been kind of in the works for years, but maybe you can touch on those, or if there are other provisions, just to give people a feel for what they might expect from this legislation.
Sure. Well, a great question. Again, there's a lot of elements to this. I just to touch on a few that you mentioned. I think, the accelerated coverage for innovative technology, I think that's one that certainly is probably top of the list for our members. And again, in addition to being incorporated in the Cures 2.0, again, we want to thank Congresswoman Delbeni and Walorski and all the original co-sponsors for, again, their bipartisan leadership to introduce the Ensuring Patient Access to Critical Breakthrough Products Act that would effectively kind of codify the MCIT rule in place. And as you know, that we've seen with FDA making improvements over the last decade plus and being more efficient, it kind of exposed some of the lags and inefficiencies on the reimbursement side. And again, there's coverage as coding as payment, so it's multifaceted here. Appreciate CMS moving forward on the payment side. If you have a breakthrough designation, it allowed you to qualify for NTAP or the pass-through in a more streamlined manner. And we're still cautiously optimistic that some form of MCIT can be implemented administratively here. We know there are some implementation issues. We've been talking with CMS and the administration on how to address those, and hopefully we can get that program moving forward and perhaps codify it legislatively. So that's clearly a priority area. And again, has not just bipartisan support up on Capitol Hill, but when CMS put out their comments, the interim final rule for comment early this year, there were over 200 comments filed, and well over 95+% were all very supportive of moving forward that MCIT-like approach. I think there were a handful of commenters who opposed it, and not surprisingly, they were effectively all private insurers who aren't known for wanting to embrace the innovative medical technology. But patient groups, physician groups, innovators all commented on the importance of moving forward on providing accelerated coverage for innovative medical technology. So I think, again, we're optimistic that something will happen in that this year. You mentioned ARPA-H as well. Again, right, this is an effort to try to harness more resources to drive innovation in key areas in healthcare, kind of like what they've done on the defense side. I think an open question here is whether it would be better suited, and I think a lot of our members feel like it would be better suited kind of a standalone entity versus within NIH. But the political winds seem to be moving to where that will be folded into NIH. So we'll see how that plays out. And then on the ballot act, again, this is something that the previous administration, when Scott Gottlieb was the commissioner of the FDA, talked about it being a priority. I think it remains a priority for the current administration as well. And effectively, MDMA's position has always been, we should be agnostic as to whether it's a lab developed test or traditional OEM developed test. That shouldn't drive the regulatory pathway. It should be based upon the risk profile of the diagnostic itself. So if it's high severity, high risk, then obviously more robust regulatory process, lower risk, lower complexity, than a more streamlined approach. And so this is something where I know there's ongoing discussions up on Capitol Hill with industry, with Republicans, with Democrats, and I think, and with FDA. And my suspicion here is that we would likely see some sort of valid, I'm not suggesting the exact bill that was introduced, but some sort of a valid would likely potentially ride with the MDUFA reauthorization, which, as you know, needs to occur by September 30th of 2022, or FDA loses the ability to collect user fees. But again, we've come close in the past, but I've had the privilege of representing the industry. This is the fifth time now in the negotiations, and there's some bumps along the road, but we always land in a place where patients, FDA, and innovators benefit, and I'm confident we'll be able to do the same. But that's the timeline in which I would look to something in ballot to happen.
Well, that's a great lead into a discussion of MDUFA. Again, the MDUFA 5, the medical device user fees, and as you said, the negotiations are going on. My understanding is that usually the parties like to kind of wrap this up by January of the year in which it's supposed to take effect, so January of 22. You're close to this, so you can lay out a time frame. But I guess the biggest question that I hear is that there seems to be a disagreement over unused or carryover MDUFA funds, and I'll let you explain more clearly what that entails. But I guess the question that I'm often asked is, why is industry skeptical of using user fees for this purpose? Some people think that this is a good effort to kind of de-risk the regulatory pathways and provide a greater level for regulatory engagement or other kind of involvement in the process for the future. So what can you tell us about the state of play of the negotiations? Did I have that timeline right? And what about the issues that are most outstanding from an industry perspective?
Right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, so I'll do my best. And let me say at the outset as well, again, being representing the industry and the negotiation team, there are ground rules in which I may not be able to get into particulars. I can't get into some of the particulars here, but there's a lot of information available through public meeting minutes that have published. Also, industry statements during the MDUFA public stakeholder meeting last fall, and others. So I'll basically share what I can, but all this is publicly available source, so I'm not compromising the current state of negotiations. I think at a macro level, and this was included in a number of the meeting minutes that have been published thus far, and also again in that October public stakeholder meeting, industry has been very consistent, and ourselves working with AVID, MIDA, and ACLA on kind of the core principles, which is timely patient access to safe and effective products. That's paramount for any agreement. Also, that congressional appropriations are the primary source of FDA funding, and user fees are additive. We don't want to get in a position where the industry now is the primary source of funding for the FDA. I think that's from a public perspective, public confidence. I think the optics of that aren't great when industry is the primary source of funding. A public citizen, we don't agree on much, but they're out there saying that Congress should remain the primary source of funding as well. And we actually had Congresswoman Eshoo, who's the chair of the Health Subcommittee, at our annual meeting in April, and she also reiterated that it's important for industry to provide additional resources through user fees, but Congress shouldn't shirk their duty in being the primary source of funding. So that's another primary tenet. Also, industry has made it clear that the user fees are intended to fund the pre-market review process. There have been a number of stakeholders and FDA and others who've talked about post-market activities. We're certainly interested in exploring those, and if they make sense, we'll work with those stakeholders to seek congressional appropriations. But again, the user fees are intended to enhance the pre-market review process. That's the way it's worked for the first 4 MDUFAs, and it's important to maintain that for MDUFA 5. And then the other 2 key points here is that the industry has really stepped up over the course of MDUFA 1, 2, 3, and 4 as it relates to funding. As I said, I've been around since the outset, and in FY 2002, industry, the annual user fees paid to FDA was $20 million. In 2020, we generated almost $300 million in user fees. So there's been an exponential growth here over the course of the last 2 decades. So we've certainly paid our fair share, and we're willing to continue significant, to targeted investments to enhance the process. But the law of large numbers comes into play here, and there can't be an expectation that this program continues to double every 5 years. That's just simply not sustainable. So those are kind of some of the key principles. And as it relates to how we're looking and the approach we're taking into this negotiation, we're really kind of taking a focus on fundamentals approach. There's obviously been a tremendous amount of uncertainty with COVID. From FDA, they've done tremendous work balancing the non-COVID work with the COVID work. But we've seen, and again, through the quarterly performance reports, with each passing quarterly performance report, more and more MDUFA 4 goals are being missed. And that's not a criticism of FDA. They've had an extraordinary workload. And the good news here is they're digging out of the EUAs. They're eating into the backlog. And by the time MDUFA 5 starts, I think most of that COVID EUA work will hopefully be dealt with, and that will open up a lot more capacity for them that they were using for COVID now that they can use for traditional reviews. So we think that's a great opportunity to double down and focus on meeting the MDUFA 4 goals that we agreed to last time and drive forward on those versus trying to add new initiatives or programs. There continue to be, particularly in OHT7, which is the diagnostic group, companies that are paying a fee and can't have, aren't a lead reviewer is not being assigned, or if they are, they're being told their MDUFA goal is, that their review times are going to be 2 or 3 times what the MDUFA goal is, and pre-subs aren't being granted. So there's still stress on the system. And that's why I think from industry's collective position, it's with all this uncertainty here for both industry and FDA, let's, focus on the fundamentals and deliver on the MDUFA 4 goals that aren't being met. And then build upon that. And part of the key area here to do so, as you noted, there is a carryover balance available for use based upon the 2020 financial report to Congress of $209 million. So these are excess collections, additional dollars that FDA can put forward and invest in the program. And by the time, I would gather, by the time we get to September 30th, which is the end of fiscal year 2021 for FDA, that carryover balance available for use will be about $250 million. And industry has made it clear, we think that those dollars should be spent to invest in additional reviewers, build capacity to drive forward and meet those MDUFA 4 goals that aren't being met. And FDA has indicated maybe they want to spend those dollars in another manner. And that's a topic of discussion. We have always had carryover balances in the past, and when we've had those, industry and FDA have agreed to what those priorities be to invest in the program, and those are the conversations we're having right now. And again, I think from industry's perspective, investing those excess dollars in reviewers building capacity, meeting those MDUFA 4 goals makes a lot of sense. And on top of that, Congress fortunately has appropriated significant funds to FDA and to CDRH specifically through COVID supplemental bill. So there's tens of millions of dollars to help deal with some of the additional workload. So again, these are important questions. We know that FDA has been spread thin with COVID. We're confident that we will turn the corner. That will free up additional capacity for traditional submissions, coupled with reinvestment carry balance. Will hopefully put them on very strong footing to succeed and enhance performance under MDUFA 5.
Well, that's great. There's a lot there. I want to just touch on one final area within the overall context of MDUFA, and let me frame this with, if you don't mind, a shameless plug for one of our previous podcasts, an interview that my colleague Dave Fillmore did with Jeff Shuren, the head of CDRH, the FDA, obviously the FDA's device branch, when he was talking about the increased priority on FDA, what he referred to as FDA sponsor engagement. And in particular, he was talking about the TAP program, TAP, and talking about how they're looking to try to see if this can combine kind of pre-sub, breakthrough, and early payer feedback in a kind of parallel review process. Those are my words, not his words. I'm paraphrasing him. But the amazing thing for me about TAP is that, and again, we've both been around this industry a long time, but when people at the agency start talking about a concierge type service, those are words, Mark, that I never thought that I'd hear together in the same sentence, FDA and concierge type service. And I don't say that to be snarky or in any way critical of the agency. I think it's a sign of how far the agency has come, frankly, under Jeff Shuren's leadership, that we're talking about those programs. But, and again, this is something that's been a lofty goal for a long time, the kind of idea of parallel review and making it more efficient for product companies, even given the different standards for FDA and CMS, safe and effective versus reasonable and necessary. But the notion of having a way for companies to interact with CDRH in a more effective way seems like an admirable goal. What are your perspectives on the TAP program, and where do you see that going in the short term, at least?
Sure. Well, again, we've got negotiations underway, but since Jeff has shared a lot publicly, I'll try to provide a little bit more color. And again, the meeting minutes are lagging, so hopefully, and they'll be out shortly. And I'll just speak to what I know we've covered at a high level. I think, as you noted, the aspirations of that TAP program are certainly laudable, to bring these players together with CMS, private payers, early interaction, all from a policy perspective, a theoretical approach. It all makes great sense. We've asked, is CMS supportive of this approach? Are private payers willing to participate? And haven't had a clear response, an affirmative response at CDRH. So, it's one thing for CDRH to say they're going to bring these pieces together, but absent those other players participating and being willing, then, it calls into question, I think, the impact. We know there's already a private payer committee that CDRH has established, in which companies who want feedback from private payers, there's a system that exists right now. As you noted, there's a pre-sub process where if companies want earlier interaction, they can have that. So I think for us, we're just trying to figure out, how does the TAP program differ from existing programs that are currently in place? And then also, I think anything that around the user fee program, there are investments for tangible goals. And I haven't heard Dr. Shuren or anybody talk about clear, compelling metrics that would be determinant of success as to whether these earlier interactions actually shorten the cycle time or bring these products to market more quickly. So, I think for industry here, it's going to be important that there's a clear and compelling, not just kind of a 30,000 foot idea, but there are distinctions from how current programs that are in place right now impact are having an impact. How will this be different? What are those objective measures we have to determine success? And I also think, it probably makes sense in this arena. It's a concept right now, hasn't been proven, hasn't been tested, but let's perhaps, think of a small pilot to kick the tires versus, scaling this whole hog. So I think those are just some, ideas that or some of the thinking, at least I have around this on pathway forward. So, and you noted the concierge component here as well. I think it's wonderful, as you noted too, to have collaborative relationship here, but just putting the political hat on here as well, where you have Democrats controlling the House, the White House, and the Senate. I'm not sure of industry significantly increasing our user fees to have an FDA employee be a concierge to industry is one that would be politically embraced by the current dynamics up on Capitol Hill.
Let me ask you one final question on the FDA, and then I want to spend a little time on CMS. Do you have any concerns over the fact that there is no permanent FDA commissioner? I mean, historically, we've been through this. We've seen this movie before. We've gone through periods of time with acting commissioners. There's some concern that for all of the experience that Janet Woodcock brings, there may be concerns whether it's mostly on the drug side. This, again, I'm just going by what you hear and read in publicly released reporting, whether concerns about the fact that she's too close to the drug industry may not result in her getting named the permanent commissioner. But do you see there being a downside to just having an acting, or again, are you of the mindset that we've been through this before and this is kind of business as usual?
Listen, I think Dr. Woodcock has a long and I think impressive career at FDA. I think she, again, yes, there's been some criticism over the Biogen situation, but looking at the entirety of the career and the record, certainly has been a great public servant, not politicizing the FDA. I think the civil servants there respect her. But that being said, this is a political town, and I've seen the similar reports where no one's sourced on the record, but administration officials are now saying that she will not be considered for the permanent role, and that's a departure of what the administration was saying a few months back. And so we certainly would like to have whether it's Dr. Woodcock or another nominee. I think the most important attributes of the commissioner are that they let the science and the professional staff do their job. Certainly they're setting a direction, priorities, but it's critical that all decisions made by the FDA are driven by the science, not politics. Again, I think there's a proud history of medtech innovators and regulators collaborating to get safe and effective products into the marketplace. And so, how this plays out, whether they'll have another acting, I think the way it's structured, she can serve through November in this acting capacity. If a nominee is then named, she can continue to serve while that nominee is vetted. But at this point, there haven't been any names floated that I think would have that have kind of risen to the top as a consensus nomination. I do think if Dr. Woodcock were put forward, she'd have the votes, Republicans and Democrats, to be confirmed. But just don't know if that's going to come to fruition. And there have been times where we've dealt with out a permanent commissioner for a longer period of time. I think that's suboptimal, but I think I'd rather have acting folks come in who have the mindset of living the science drive decisions and the career staff than a permanent person who may have a more political bent. So, we're obviously keeping our eyes and ears open and to see what direction things may move towards.
Thanks for listening so far. This interview will continue after this short message. Market Pathways is the #1 publication that covers the people, challenges, and opportunities impacting the global medical device regulatory, reimbursement, and policy spheres. MyStrategist.com is your digital home to access all of our coverage and read the latest issue of Market Pathways.
Let's switch gears and talk about CMS. I think when I'm talking to companies large and small, I think the consensus view that I'm hearing is that whereas if we asked CEOs a decade ago what the biggest problem facing the industry was, you would get regulatory and the FDA as the answer. I think that has shifted dramatically, in large part due to the advances that Jeff Shuren has been able to implement at CDRH. And now what I hear is that reimbursement is really the biggest issue facing MedTech. So first of all, I'd be interested in your perspective, what you hear from your members on that. And secondarily, talk a little bit about how the kind of private public payer dynamics have changed. Again, if we were having this conversation maybe you have to go back a little bit further, maybe 20 years ago, really it would be all about Medicare. The MACs and even the private payers kind of fell in line after Medicare made a decision, and really so the focus was on Medicare. Now I think it's fair to say that those other players have a much more significant role in the process. And so talk about how that process has changed. I know there's a lot there, but I think reimbursement has really become a primary topic for the industry.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about that. And certainly the uncertainty around the reimbursement landscape, as you noted, is kind of akin to where we were on the regulatory side 15 years ago. And in fact, I was just talking with Josh Mackauer recently and, kind of sharing and discussing the environment. I think one of the differences here is that with FDA, you had a single entity who was, the primary focus of bringing products to the market from a regulatory standpoint. But as you noted, when you look at the reimbursement landscape, it's a multi-headed monster here. You have, CMS making their national decisions. You have local Medicare contractors making local coverage determinations. You have private payers with their private payer side. They also have a Medicare Advantage side. So you have a number of different players there who are providing insurance. And again, it's not just whether the technology is covered, it's how the payment rates are set, and that's either by CMS or the private payers. But that's influenced. And then you have the coding piece, which, and the AMA and how the CPT process works, and also the RUC and how the RUC translates into payment. So again, as I've just described, there are so many different, almost like whack-a-mole here on the reimbursement side when we're looking to try to drive improvements. And, we have been working with the AMA for almost 10 years now and driving more transparency and consistency around the CPT process. And we appreciate, the collaboration. And just recently they've announced something we've been pushing for many years, that there'll be an industry voting representative on the CPT panel, which we think is an important step forward. As it relates to, the coverage side, as I noted, I think obviously there's a great opportunity here for CMS to lead by example and providing provisional or coverage for innovative technologies in a more efficient way while that company generates additional data. So kind of, yes, there's parallel review, there's CED, but those have not worked as well as folks would hope. So there's a way, I think, in general consensus that we need to do more there. And on the private payer side, we've worked with Governor Levitt and others to try to bring some of the private payers together to facilitate more transparency on how they make coverage determinations. James Chambers out of Tufts did some research for us a few years back and kind of looked at the top 20 private payers, I think representing about 80% of covered lives, and mapped what their publicly available information that they had on how they make coverage determinations. And Steve, as you can imagine, there's great variability by the private payers as to how they make coverage determinations. I don't think a single private payer in a public-facing way said they incorporated patient preference into their coverage determination. So these are all things where we continue to hear the private payers saying, industry, you're not generating the right evidence and data to support coverage. And we're saying, well, we'll provide greater clarity on what we need. And so there's kind of, back and forth here. And we've actually, put together some documents mapping out the best practices globally from Australia, Germany, across the world to generate high quality evidence to help facilitate more efficient coverage. But again, there's, unlike the FDA side, where you have a single federal entity, this is much more widespread and the stakeholders. So not saying it's insurmountable, it's just more complex as to how you move forward and approach this. But I do think that, again, CMS should be commended for some of the steps they've taken on the payment side to provide enhanced payments for an accelerated process to qualify for the new technology add-on payment in the inpatient setting and the pass-through status on the outpatient setting. And hopefully we can make some additional progress here on the coverage side with the MCIT like approach. And also the fact that Jason Bennett, they've got the new Office of Technology set up within CMS to help, because it had been a silo even within CMS, the coding, the coverage, and payment folks didn't talk with each other, and trying to facilitate more dialogue and engagement earlier on in the process to make sure coding, coverage, and payments are all addressed. I think these are, positive steps that we just continue to have to build upon.
You mentioned the increased complexity of the reimbursement landscape. And, from an industry perspective, another challenge is dealing with the increased complexity of technology and how the payers go about addressing that. And let me just cite one example. We're seeing more and more products that are utilizing some kind of AI technology, which obviously presents issues for CMS and the other payers in terms of calculating payments for technologies using AI. And this is not a hypothetical situation. I mean, it's something that's affecting a lot of companies. We can think of a number of examples. I mean, iRhythm comes to mind, HeartFlow comes to mind. Talk a little bit about, is this something that has hit MDMA's radar screen, and what are you doing or advising companies in terms of working with CMS and maybe also with other payers to address these issues of complex technologies? Because obviously we're only going to see more of these in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's certainly something we've been actively involved in. And really it comes down to that the certain reimbursement structures aren't set up to map towards where the technology and innovation is driving towards. And something that MDMA has long supported, and I think has consensus at the high level, is we want to pay for value, not volume. And there've been a number of efforts underway to try to move the payment system in that direction. But then when you get to, again, these types of technologies that have high quality outcomes, but aren't, and we all know too that labor is the single largest cost driver in healthcare. And so when you have these technologies that can use AI to drive better outcomes for the patient, but may not have the same labor component of the physician time and others, it can really, drive down the way that current formulas are structured, drive down the total reimbursement, which, can have a hospital losing money on if they utilize these technologies because of the artificially low reimbursement rates set by these some of these antiquated models. And so I think from our perspective, it's follow through. If we all say that value is what we should be incentivizing versus volume, then that's not just it's better outcomes, but also in ways in which that this technology can be delivered perhaps more efficiently, but don't undermine or minimize the impact of that technology. If it can be delivered in a less labor intensive way, or driving other components here that help drive better outcomes that maybe aren't incentivized or rewarded appropriately in the current structure. So it is absolutely mission critical effort that we need to address. Otherwise, the investment and the advances here will dry up if the reimbursement systems don't keep pace.
In that same spirit of talking about value, one of the other trends that obviously we're seeing in the industry is the shift of procedures when possible to go from more acute to less acute settings. So, for example, from an OR to an ambulatory service center and perhaps even to a doctor's office. There's been some concern among industry that about CMS appeared to do an about face on the issue of site of service rules and kind of reversing allowances for ASCs. Is that how you read that? And does that raise concerns for you, just in the spirit of what you were just talking about in terms of trying to continue this drive for increased value?
Yeah, I think you can't look at it as just a broad swath. I think you have to look kind of procedure by procedure. There was talk, I know that our members was concerned about, getting rid of the inpatient only list for certain procedures, because, I think having the flexibility to treat different patients with different severities and different sites of service makes a lot of sense. But I don't think, but I think the concern would be if they were driving everything to the lowest cost center, may not appreciate the complexities of certain patients. And so, from our perspective, I think what's important here, and we've been actually working with the ASC Association on this and some folks up on Capitol Hill. One of the biggest issues, and this came to light in COVID, when again the pause in elective surgeries took place, and then even if things reopened, the patient maybe wasn't keen on going into hospital, even an outpatient affiliated with a hospital, but the ASC was an area where they felt more comfortable, and it was medically appropriate to have the procedures done there. Right now, if you're an inpatient or outpatient and you're a Medicare beneficiary, your out-of-pocket copay is capped. And so, I think it's about $1,500, $1,700. There's an upper limit of your out-of-pocket expenses that you have if you get treated in that outpatient center. But if that same procedure is done in the ASC, there's no cap that exists for those Medicare beneficiaries, and they could be paying multiple thousands of dollars on top of that copay. And so that's an area, I think, as we look to how do you drive care to the most effective, efficient setting. You have to have payment rates that again map where the system, the provider, the physician, the innovator, all there's payment rates that effectively and accurately reflect the costs. But you also want to make sure that there aren't disincentives here where a patient has to pay, again, appropriate to do in the ASC, but if they're going there, their out-of-pocket expenses $5,000 versus $1,500. Those are, I think, some of the changes that hopefully we can see being made moving forward.
We've talked about legislative issues and then specifically both FDA and CMS regulatory issues. Let's close with talking about some just general policy issues that seem to register on medical device companies' radar screens these days. The first is concerns over executive order on supply chains and also the push for made in the USA and what impact that is likely to have on companies' supply chains.
Sure. Well, I think, and we have made this clear to the previous administration, the current administration as well. We certainly understand and appreciate efforts to incentivize more domestic manufacturing capacity here in the U.S. We're the global leader in medical device innovation, and have significant manufacturing capabilities here, and always can look to ways to enhance that. But what we don't want to have happen is the unintended consequences of not appreciating that there is a global supply chain here, that many of our members are serving patients across the globe. And in some instances, the raw materials, for example, for surgical gloves. I mean, Malaysia has, the lion's share of the raw materials, and therefore drive much of the manufacturing. And so, thinking that, okay, well, we're going to, can't grow rubber trees here, or we're bringing those raw materials over here and manufacturing gloves here. If people want to pay 10 times more for surgical gloves, then maybe that's an option. But again, I don't think that would be a sustainable model as well. So for us, in our conversations, again, we've had with Republicans, Democrats up on Capitol Hill, certainly ongoing ways to incentivize greater domestic manufacturing, but we don't want to do anything that would create unintended consequences that could then shut down the ability for access of these products, particularly in the midst of the public health emergency. And if we start putting up certain parameters or preferences for domestically manufactured, you could see other countries reciprocating. And again, I think there are ways to incentivize with more carrots, less stick. And our hope is that as we move forward here, there's greater resilience, redundancy to help for in the event that we face this global surge again, but doing so in a way that doesn't stymie the ability for the supply chain to run efficiently.
Another issue of interest is prior authorization, because, again, this is something that can delay both patient and provider access to new technologies. So let me just ask you: is prior authorization dead?
Well, it's this is a concerning issue that we've been seeing. In the outpatient rule last year, CMS, and historically in the past, there were the year before, they proposed prior auth for 5 procedures, but they had both a cosmetic and a therapeutic kind of uses. And so there one could see, okay, you want to have prior auth in place to make sure that people aren't, getting something for a cosmetic benefit under a therapeutic claim. But in the last outpatient rule last year, there were 2 procedures that are medically necessary that CMS proposed, and as of July 1st, moving forward with prior authorization in place. And what's concerning here is there was no transparency about the metrics CMS used to reach the conclusion what triggered these technologies for prior authorization. I mean, one was a technology that has a positive national coverage determination, spinal cord stimulator to treat pain, and there's so much focus and attention, rightly so, over the last many years about needing non-opioid alternatives to manage pain, and medical technologies are certainly in the mix. And so, again, positive national coverage determination meets the needs of a non-opioid alternative to manage pain, and then CMS says, okay, but if you want this, there's a prior authorization hurdle you have to go through. And so we're watching this closely. CMS is claiming that it's not going to add friction, add delay, add cost for the administrator. But again, this is something public comments, the physicians, the hospitals, innovators, patients, all commented that this did not make sense to move forward with prior authorization, and yet CMS still moved forward. So we're watching this closely, and we're seeing this on the private payer side as well. I think it is concerning when there are unnecessary hurdles that are put in place that slow patient access to necessary medical technologies, particularly when access has been such a challenge through this public health emergency.
Since we last spoke, the new European device regulatory regimen, MDR, became effective. And what we've seen is a reversal of the trend of U.S. companies commercializing first in Europe when CE mark was much easier to obtain with less clinical data, less time, less cost, and looking more to the U.S. And I'm sure you've seen some of the recent data that bears that out. do you expect that trend to continue? I mean, at some point, obviously, Europe is going to settle into a status quo. And let me ask you to put this also in a larger context: the whole issue of harmonizing regulations internationally has been again talked about for decades. What impact do you think MDR will have on the goal of harmonizing international medtech regulations?
Well, I think obviously, this has been a bumpy transition here. I think, we've heard from a number of our members that, the costs associated with this, some of the products out there weren't necessarily, profit generating, but they're good for patients. But you can't sustain, the added cost of relisting and registering. The impact, I don't think is going to be known for a few years out now, on what this means for medical technologies getting access in Europe. As you noted, there have been for many decades now talks of global harmonization. It was the Global Harmonization Task Force, and now that was the predecessor. Now it's IMDRF. And from my perspective, I think the FDA, and I'll let Dr. Scher and others speak for themselves, but my impression was that FDA was always supportive of global harmonization as long as the world would follow the FDA process. I'm not sure, how much of a give and take the conversations were had in the past. And certainly when it was a more efficient process, there were some less than complimentary statements made by FDA regulators about the EU process. Now that those changes have been made, there's a potential maybe for some greater alignment here. And that certainly would be, I think, a benefit if there is an opportunity, just like on the inspection side with MDSAP. Can we leverage some efficiency at the pre-market side? I think there's potential there, but we're still, I think, a ways away.
Let me wrap up by looking ahead at potential challenges, or some might even call potential threats that the industry might face. And they're both areas that one could argue where medtech runs the risk of kind of being tainted by association. And the first is the issue of drug pricing, which has obviously become a priority with the new administration. And we've both been covering this industry long enough to know that oftentimes the differences between med tech and pharma are not as differentiated in the minds of legislators. And again, I have to credit MDMA with the great job that you've done over the years in familiarizing legislators, who often change every 2 or 6 years on Capitol Hill, with the unique attributes of the medical device industry. But nonetheless, sometimes medtech gets lumped in with pharma. And so do you expect any kind of spillover effect that might affect the medical device industry as a result of this current concern about drug pricing?
This is something where I think there is, a great appreciation by members on both sides of the aisle about the unique characteristics of our industry versus others. Again, when you look at our industry, there are, I think, 80% of our industry has 50 employees or less, and 98% have 500 employees or less. So it really is a small company, physician, entrepreneur, innovator working together to drive improvements in healthcare. And, I think there are also important distinctions, just the way that we talked earlier about reimbursement. I mean, there's kind of bundled rates CMS sets that that's how, medical devices are reimbursed as part of a bundled DRG or APC, unlike, ASP plus 6. And so, there are differences. I also kind of, I think an example that many policymakers appreciate, look to the example of a drug-eluting stent. When it came onto the market, first, it was about $3,500. Now, with robust competition, I think you see drug-eluting stent maybe $1,200 to $1,400. So you've seen improvements in the technology and a significant reduction in the cost. And I think those dynamics are different than what we may see in the pharmaceutical space. So, I think there's an appreciation of distinctions within each industry. We remain engaged with Republicans, Democrats, the administration. And I think based upon all of our feedback, their policymakers do understand the distinctions, not suggesting that some may try to blur the lines in some instances, but I think there's an appreciation of the distinctions between the two industries.
And the last thing I want to touch on is periodically you'll see press reports coming out with regard to specific situations or specific events that sometimes are used to tar the entire industry. I'm thinking back in Europe to the PIP breast implant scandal, or the metal-on-metal implant, orthopedic implants issue. You'll recall in Europe there was a series of investigative media reports called the implant files that seemed to have a greater impact in Europe than in the US. And we've recently seen an article in ProPublica talking about Medtronic HVADs and criticizing both the company and the FDA, and at least implicitly, if not explicitly, talking about the fact that both could have done more to alleviate the issue with these specific products that resulted in problems for the patient beyond simply just pulling the product from the market. I don't know if you have any specific comments on the situation, the articles, and what, if anything, more companies and the agency can do. And more broadly speaking, what do you see as the impact of this kind of coverage from the perspective of, what can the industry do to make sure that people are getting a correct view of because again, as we've said many times, I like to say I'd like to have an Oreo with cookie with no calories, but it doesn't work like that. And there is a certain amount of inherent risk in developing innovative medical technologies.
Yeah, well, that's obviously a lot to unpack there. And having been at MDMA for 20 years, I think you do see this ebb and flow of instances in which the suboptimal outcome, opportunity to improve the process. But I think looking big picture here, I think it's extraordinary. And again, whether it was the bleeding edge or ICIJ that you mentioned, for the most part, these were a handful of examples over 20 or 30 plus years that were paraded out. You mentioned metal on metal. I mean, that was a pre-amendment class 3 device that, both the Democrats and Republicans didn't reclassify or maintain its class 3 status and call for a PMA. The PIP instance, I mean, that was illegal activity. They were using commercial grade silicone. So, no amount of regulation can prevent a bad actor who wants to break the law. That being said, again, there's always ways in which we can improve the process. I think, the FDA in 2018 put out their medical device safety action plan of a number of steps that they're taking to improve on their already, best in the world gold standard when it comes to safety. And I think, Dr. Shuren has shared this at our meeting, as it's worth sharing with your listeners. I think that the number, the way he phrased it is that the number of products that people have been talking about over the last, in which there have been issues, again, over a 20 or 30 year period. He said they make more decisions by lunchtime in one day on bringing new products to the market than the totality of those products that people are highlighting. And there are currently 197,000, I believe, medical technologies on the market, improving patient care, helping physicians treat their patients, letting people live better, longer, healthier lives. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us, both as trade associations, as individual companies, speaking to communities, though, to remain engaged on this issue and other issues, to tell the great stories of the improved patient outcomes that result from medical technology innovation. And that doesn't mean that we can't constantly, just like with innovators, continuous improvement and concerted, efforts to enhance the process. But that doesn't mean, you take one or two outliers and say, okay, the whole system needs to be upended. That's absolutely the wrong thing to do when it comes to serving patients, promoting innovation. And I think that's just incumbent upon us to, again, stay collectively engaged to make sure the facts are understood by the public.
Well, Mark, as always, great talking to you. Really appreciate your insights. As we're recording this in the end of August, and I guess I'll never get over the notion of thinking about my calendar as if I'm still in school. So I think of this being coming up into the new school year. No doubt that we're going to have a very interesting year from a medtech perspective, and one that seems that it's going to hold a lot of opportunities for the industry moving forward. So we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, and we look forward to revisiting these issues with you in the future. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Always great to be with you, and appreciate all the great work that you and the team do.
Watch the full interview and become a part of our global MedTech community on mystrategist.com.